Metabolisms of nutrients by your body's cell will produce an imbalance of water and essential ions, and it also produces various wastes such as carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste. Those nitrogenous wastes are going to be things like creatine, urea, and ammonia. So, essential substances are going to be retained to ensure an internal homeostasis in your and like proper body functioning. Your urinary system is your primarily going to be what's responsible for removal of the nitrogenous waste from the blood. So, in addition to this purely excretory function, the kidneys have to maintain the electrolyte, acid base, and fluid balance of the blood. Kidneys are thus going to be your major homeostatic organs of the body. Any kind of malfunction of the urinary system, particularly the kidneys, leads to a failure of homeostasis, resulting in death unless that's corrected. Now, things that we will cover in this chapter: the kidneys will have three distinct regions of a rich blood supply. We will note that the nephrons are going to be the functional units of kidneys, and we will also have an overview of the filtration, absorption, and secretion, and how they are the key processes of urine formation. We will also look at the developmental aspects of the urinary system, and I have a good introduction video to go along to start this chapter off, but of course you still need to be reading your chapter and going over your notes.
Like I was saying, the urinary system plays a huge role in regulating the fluids in our body, regulating our body's blood pressure and blood volume, regulating the pH or the acidity of our blood, and lots of other things like getting rid of waste. In this video, we're going to focus on the anatomy of the urinary system, where everything's located, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the physiology, what happens in the different parts of the urinary system. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. So let's start off with the kidneys. The kidneys are going to be the main organ of the urinary system. They're going to be the organ that's actually filtering things out from the blood and producing all of the urine that we make. That allows us to regulate lots of things, such as our blood volume, our blood pressure, which is super important, regulating the pH or the acidity of our blood, regulating the ions that are in our blood, and just getting rid of things that we don't want to be in our bloodstream anymore, getting rid of waste from our blood. And so the kidneys are where all of that takes place. The kidneys will decide what do we bring out of the blood, what do we put back into the blood to make sure that our blood pressure, volume, pH, all of those things stay at normal, homeostatically healthy levels. Now, sitting just above or superior to the kidneys are the little kidney hats, adrenal glands, which I still think look like party hats for the kidneys. And the adrenal glands aren't generally considered part of the urinary system. They just happen to be right on top of the kidneys, so it's hard to not include them in a diagram. They're part of the endocrine system. They make cortisol, adrenaline, and other hormones that help regulate our stress response and other functions throughout the body. On the other side of my diagram, I'm going to draw a cross section of a kidney. That way we can see kind of inside the kidney how things are organized there. We'll talk a little bit about kidney anatomy in this video. Now, I keep saying that the kidneys filter the blood. Well, if that's the case, we have to have some blood coming into the kidneys. So I'm going to draw a couple arteries on here to show the blood coming into the kidneys. First, I have labeled the descending aorta. That's going to come out of the heart and then come down, and it's going to pass right by the kidneys. So blood is going to be traveling down the descending aorta. And two more branches that I have drawn are called the common iliac arteries. So I've got the left and the right common iliac artery. Those are going to go down into the legs. And there's lots of other branches of arteries that I didn't draw on here just for simplicity's sake. But one branch that we are concerned about here is going to be called the renal artery. And the renal artery is going to be a branch off the aorta that goes to the kidneys, basically to deliver blood to the kidneys to be filtered. So as blood leaves the heart, it travels down the descending aorta, and some of that blood will travel through the left renal artery, some will travel through the right renal artery, and into the kidneys. Now at this point, you've heard me say renal a few times, one for the adrenal glands and one for the renal artery. Renal just means kidney, and so our adrenal glands are actually named for being next to, that's what ad means, and kidney, which is what renal means. So renal is the Latin word for kidney. We also have nephro, which we'll see sometimes like a nephrologist, a kidney doctor, or nephron, which are the functional units that actually filter out the blood in these different parts of the kidney here. We'll take a little bit closer look at those in a second. So renal is Latin for kidney. Nephro is Greek for kidney. If you see any of those terms, just know we're referring to something related to the kidneys. Now we have blood coming into the kidneys, so we have to have blood coming out of the kidneys. So I'm going to draw in some veins here. The main vein that we have here is the inferior vena cava, which is going to bring blood back up to the heart so it can get pumped to the lungs and so forth. We We have the common iliac vein, which are these two branches at the bottom that go into either of the two legs. And so those are going to be bringing blood up to the inferior vena cava. And connected to the kidneys, we're going to have the renal veins. The renal veins are going to take blood that's been filtered from the kidney and bring that back into the vena cava so it can circulate back up to the heart. So if we look at the path of blood flow here, blood will travel down the aorta through either renal artery, through these smaller branches into the kidneys. It'll get filtered out, and then it's going to return through these renal veins back to here, then to the vena cava, and then back up to the heart. So blood coming in, blood coming out. And of course, we also need waste coming out, or a place for the urine to go. And again, urine is just going to be fluid and other waste that's filtered out of the bloodstream. So whenever you pee, that came from your blood. And it's not red because it doesn't have red blood cells in it, but it's fluid from your blood. So in order to collect that urine and bring it to the outside of the body, we've got things called ureters. The ureters are just little tubes that are going to come from the kidney and travel down to the bladder. You've got one on either side, one for each kidney that's collecting the urine, bringing it down to the bladder. All right, let's take a little closer look at the kidneys here. When the blood comes in through the renal arteries, it's going to travel up through here. And we've got two kind of regions of the kidney here. The outside of the kidney is called the renal cortex. Anytime you see the word cortex, it just means the outside. So this kind of dark pink in the kidney, that's all the renal cortex. And speaking of cortex, in the adrenal gland, this outer part, this outer layer is going to be the adrenal cortex. So cortex just means outer layer. So the blood comes in through this part of the renal cortex called the renal column into the renal cortex here. And in this light pink area, which is called the renal medulla, that's where the actual filtration is going to be happening. The renal medulla is also often called the renal pyramids because they're sort of triangular shaped, and they contain nephrons, which is where filtration happens. Now, if you look at the end of the sections of renal medulla or the renal pyramids, you'll see that it connects to little yellow spaces right there. Those are going to be called the calyx, and the calyx are going to be collecting ducts for the urine that we filtered out of the blood. So the urine will travel through this yellow area, collect together, and then exit down through the ureter to head to the bladder. Anything that's not filtered out is going to travel through the blue tubes here, which are going to be the renal vein, and then back to the heart. And of course, those tubes aren't actually blue. That's just to represent low oxygen blood. Okay, so we've filtered out waste and fluid and everything. Those have traveled down the ureters, and then now we're here at the bladder. And the bladder is just going to be a collecting place for the urine, so we can keep it somewhere until we're ready to get rid of it. One interesting thing about the bladder is that the ureter actually connects to the bladder at the bottom. It doesn't connect at the top. It wraps around sort of behind and connects at the bottom of the bladder. Now the bladder is very stretchy. It's got what we call transitional epithelium, which means that the cells can change shape as the bladder stretches. Now, leaving the bladder is one final tube called the urethra. In female anatomy, the urethra is going to exit out through the vulva area, and in male anatomy, the urethra will pass through the penis to the outside of the body. Now, we want to be able to control when we urinate, and so we're going to have a couple sphincters which will help us do that. We've got the internal urethral sphincter and the external urethral sphincter. And just like the anal sphincters, the difference between the two is that the internal urethral sphincter is involuntarily controlled. It's sort of always closed. We don't have to think about it. And the external urethral sphincter, we can consciously control it. So whenever you need to pee and you feel you need to pee, but you're holding it in, you're using your external urethral sphincter. All right, let's do a quick recap of that. We have blood that'll travel down the descending aorta, and some of that blood will go through the renal arteries. From the renal arteries, it'll branch off and go into the renal cortex and then to the renal medulla, where it's going to get filtered out by nephrons into these collecting ducts down into the ureter. All the blood that doesn't get filtered out and become urine is going to travel back to the heart through the renal vein and then the vena cava. Everything that did get filtered out, which is now our urine, is going to pass down the ureter into the bladder, where the ureter connects at the bottom of the bladder. The urine will stay in the bladder until we're ready to expel it by urinating. And so then we'll relax the urethral sphincters, and the urine will travel down through the urethra to the outside of the body. All right, so here we have a human kidney. Let me turn it over real quick. And there's the cross section of the kidney. Here we can see the ureter coming out of the kidney. These are going to be the calyxes, or the branches. They're going to collect the urine and bring that down to the ureter. We also have some renal blood vessels here, and you can see those branching out, going to the different parts of the kidney. We can follow the ureter down here to the bladder. And in this model, there's a catheter going up into the bladder. And you can see inside the bladder, it's sort of wavy like that. And the bladder is going to be really stretchy, like I said, so that it can expand whenever it collects with urine. Just below the bladder, we have the prostate gland. So this would have been from a male patient with the prostate gland, which is just below the bladder, and the urethra actually travels through the prostate gland. So there's the kidney, ureter, bladder, and then the urethra will exit down from the bottom. Okay, here we have a 3D model of the urinary system. We've got the descending aorta right here, the renal artery on either side. We have the renal vein, which is coming out of the kidneys and bringing the blood back to the vena cava and up to the heart. We have the adrenal gland, the kidney. This is going to be the ureter, which is going to collect the urine and bring it down to the bladder. So here's the bladder. And if I open up the bladder, we can see down there, there's where the urethra will be, and that urethra will connect to the outside of the body. If I come back up to the kidney here, we can see the renal pyramids, which are part of the renal medulla, and then the renal cortex, which is going to be the outside part here, where we see all those blood vessels kind of wrapping around. This is going to be the calyx, which is going to collect the urine so they can travel down into the ureter there. And if we want to get really up close to the kidney, we've got another model here. This is the renal pyramids. These are going to be the nephrons that I talked about. And you can see all the blood vessels where it comes in through the renal column to the renal cortex, and then down to the renal medulla where the nephrons are, where that blood gets filtered and becomes the urine, which is collected in these calyxes, and then down through the ureter. All right, take a minute, pause the video, see if you can identify all of the parts as well as all the arteries and veins that I have labeled on the diagram. All right, here are those labels again, so you can check and see what you knew and what you still need to practice. I'm about to draw this diagram of a nephron. It's the functional unit of filtration in the kidney. But before we jump to the whiteboard and do that, let's take a look at the kidney model and see where these things are located. So here on my model is one of the nephrons. You'll see this loop that comes down, and you notice that loop is also in the diagram. There's going to be this capsule that surrounds some blood vessels. That's going to be right in there. You can kind of see those yellow dots. And there's going to be a collecting duct, which we see on the right side of our diagram that I drew. And that collecting duct is going to take the urine that gets filtered out of the blood. It's going to take it down to the bottom. It's going to enter into the calyx, then to the major calyx, and it'll travel down here through the ureters to get down to the bladder. These nephrons, which include the capsule, the tube that loops down, the collecting duct, there's millions of those throughout the kidney. They're located in the renal pyramids, including the renal medulla, and then part of them is in the renal cortex. Those tubes of the nephron are also surrounded with blood vessels that come into the kidney. So we see those blood vessels right there. We also see those in the diagram that I've drawn. So now that we know where those nephrons are located within the kidney, let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. So there's two main regions in our diagram here. Here at this top half above the dotted line is the renal cortex, and then everything below the dotted line is the renal medulla. Also being drawn right now, we've got something that's called the Bowman's capsule. This Bowman's capsule is going to be the beginning of the nephron, where filtration first happens. But before we get into that, we have to deliver some blood to the nephron. And so we're going to have a renal artery coming in, or really a branch of the renal artery that's going to be bringing blood in. And if you notice here, once that renal artery gets to the Bowman's capsule, it's going to kind of split into a couple sections and sort of form this thin coiled section of artery here that kind of bunches up in a ball like this inside of the Bowman's capsule. Now that bunch of artery is called the glomerulus. So blood will come in through this branch of the renal artery into the glomerulus. Now if you notice, the branches of the glomerulus are a lot thinner than the artery coming in. And so imagine if you try to take a bunch of fluid that's in a vessel like this and then suddenly force it into a thinner or smaller vessel. Well, that's going to greatly increase the pressure. That increased pressure from trying to force a lot of fluid into tiny little vessels is going to cause a lot of that fluid to leak out of the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. And that's the whole point of this, is to get fluid from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. We call that process filtration. And basically that's going to mean that the blood plasma, and it's going to be about 20% of the blood plasma that comes through here, is going to exit the glomerulus and go into the Bowman's capsule. Now once that blood plasma or that fluid is in the Bowman's capsule, we call it the filtrate. So as you hear me refer to the filtrate throughout the rest of the video, I'm talking about fluid from the blood that was blood plasma, that once it's in the Bowman's capsule and then the rest of the nephron, we stop calling it blood plasma, we start calling it filtrate. So in a period of 24 hours, we're going to filter about 180 liters of our blood plasma through the Bowman's capsule to become filtrate. Now, if we urinated out 180 liters per day, we would get dehydrated super quick and we would not have enough fluid for our bodies to survive. So luckily, filtration is not the only thing that's going to occur. We also have the process of reabsorption. So we're going to take a lot of fluid out of our blood, but we're going to put most of it back, and we're just going to keep out stuff that we want to get rid of. That could be water if we have too much water in the body. It's going to be other wastes that we're trying to get rid of. It's going to be salts if we have too much salt in the body. And it's really kind of a weird, inefficient system, because why not just take out the stuff we want to get rid of? But that's not how our kidneys work. We're going to filter out lots of things, even stuff that we want to keep, and then we'll selectively determine what do we put back into the bloodstream to keep in the body. And that's how we'll regulate what we urinate out and what we keep inside. Filtration is going to take place in the Bowman's capsule and glomerulus, and then reabsorption is going to take place through the whole rest of the nephron that we're about to draw on our diagram. Okay, so where does that filtrate go next? Well, first it's going to go through something called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's right after the Bowman's capsule. It's going to be proximal to it. We'll have a distal convoluted tubule that's farther away, but proximal because it's close to the beginning. Convoluted just means that it sort of meanders, like it doesn't just go straight to where it's going. It's going to kind of take some turns and stuff like that. Once it reaches the end of the proximal convoluted tubule, it's going to descend down into the medulla in what we call the nephron loop, or sometimes called the loop of Henle. So far, everything we've done has been in the renal cortex, or the outer layer of the kidney. But now this loop is going to dip down into the medulla, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. But just know for now that dips down into the medulla, and then it comes back out of the medulla into the renal cortex. There, the nephron loop is going to connect to the distal convoluted tubule. Notice it's kind of windy and convoluted, just like the proximal one was. Once it gets to the end of the distal convoluted tubule, it's going to connect with something called the collecting duct. If you notice in the collecting duct, there's lots of branches coming out of it. That's because there's lots of nephrons that all connect to the same collecting duct. But the big idea here is that all of the urine that we're filtering out is collecting together into collecting ducts, which then join together to form the calyx, which is going to connect to the ureter so we can bring that down to the bladder. So our end of the collecting duct there will connect down to the ureter. But we haven't talked about that reabsorption component yet. Let's go ahead and add in the other blood vessels here. So we said that we have blood coming in. About 20% of our blood plasma is going to filter out into the Bowman's capsule from the glomerulus. But 80% of the plasma is going to stay in these blood vessels, as well as all the red blood cells and white blood cells. Those are going to stay in the blood vessel. They're too big to really go through filtration here and end up there. Also, a lot of our bigger proteins in our blood plasma are too big to actually get filtered out. So most of those will stay in the blood vessel here. That blood vessel is going to take that blood over here to where the nephron loop is so that reabsorption can occur. Let's start in the proximal convoluted tubule and see what happens here. So we filtered out a bunch of the fluid, and then H2O and nutrients are going to get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Like I said, it's kind of inefficient. We filtered a bunch out, but we're going to put most of that back into the bloodstream. About 2/3 of the water that we filtered out is going to reabsorb back into the bloodstream from the proximal convoluted tubule. And a lot of the important nutrients that we need, such as sugars and vitamins and stuff, are going to diffuse out of the proximal convoluted tubule into the blood vessels again so that we don't urinate out all of that good stuff that we need in our bloodstream. Okay, so about 2/3 of the water and most of the nutrients have been reabsorbed back into our artery here. And then as this nephron loop descends down into the medulla, it's going to get increasingly salty. In other words, it's going to have a lot more sodium, it's going to have a lot more chloride and other ions in that area. We're going to talk about how the medulla got so salty in just a minute, but for now, know that this is very salty. It's a lot more salty as we descend down into the medulla. And what salt does is it essentially attracts water. So as the nephron loop descends, water is going to be diffusing out of that nephron loop back into our blood vessels. And that process of water diffusion, because of a highly salty area, is osmosis. So the big idea there, water is leaving the descending nephron loop, and it's being attracted essentially to the saltiness of the medulla, and that water is going to enter back into our bloodstream here. From there, the filtrate is going to wrap around the nephron loop and enter the ascending nephron loop. Now in the ascending nephron loop, we suddenly have an area that's impermeable to water. Water can't leave or enter in this ascending part of the loop. So it's different physiologically than the descending part. In the descending part, water was leaving due to osmosis. In the ascending part, water can't diffuse back and forth into or out of the nephron loop. What is happening though is sodium and chloride ions are being actively transported out. They're being pumped out. And that's what's actually making the medulla salty in the first place, is that we have pumps for sodium and chloride to pump out those ions, which is going to make this medulla salty. And just because it's happening here on the diagram, it's really happening all throughout this whole medulla area right here. This active transport of the salt ions is really what makes this osmosis part earlier on in the nephron loop possible. But of course, it's active transport, so it takes a lot of energy. So we need a lot of energy for our kidneys to function. Like I said, it's a little bit inefficient. Okay, great. From there, the filtrate is going to travel through the distal convoluted tubule. And at the distal convoluted tubule, water can diffuse out. Note that I said it can diffuse out. I didn't say that it will. That depends on something. The water can also diffuse out from the collecting duct. But again, that's going to depend. This is where the true regulation happens, where our body is going to decide, do we want to try to conserve as much water as possible, or do we want to try to urinate out a lot of water? So basically, if you're dehydrated, we're going to reabsorb as much water as we can. The distal convoluted tubule will become very leaky to water, so that water is going to be leaving, and so will the collecting duct. The collecting duct will become very permeable to water, so that the water can leak out into the salty medulla area. And again, that's if we're dehydrated. We're trying to conserve water. We don't want any water leaving through the collecting duct to the ureter, because then we're going to lose that water whenever we urinate. Instead, if we're dehydrated, we want to get any water that we can that's still left over in our filtrate. We want to get that water back into the bloodstream. So we're going to let it leak out of here and diffuse back into our bloodstream so we can keep it in circulation and keep all of the water in our body. But how does our body regulate that? Well, there's a special hormone that's involved. And so this process of reabsorption of water in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct is only going to happen if ADH is present. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. It's a hormone released by the pituitary gland. That's the little gland hanging off the front of your brain. It's also known as vasopressin, but I like the term ADH because it describes what it does. A diuretic is anything that makes you pee more, and an anti-diuretic is something that would make you pee less. So anti-diuretic hormone makes you pee less. How does it make you urinate less? Well, it's going to cause the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to leak more water, so water leaves there and enters back into the bloodstream. The plus in my diagram just means that it stimulates water getting reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. But what if we're not dehydrated? What if we've been drinking plenty of water and our body actually has more water than it needs and it wants to get rid of some of that water? Well, then our brain, our pituitary, is going to stop releasing ADH, antidiuretic hormone. If antidiuretic hormone is not present, well then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct will not be permeable to water. So in other words, all of the filtrate that enters into the distal convoluted tubule is going to stay there as it travels through and down the collecting duct. All that water will stay in the collecting duct and then into the ureter, so we can urinate out a lot of water. That would make our urine a lot lighter because it has so much water present. In other words, it's very dilute. To contrast that, if we had a lot of ADH, well then we're going to be reabsorbing most of that water, and so that's going to make the urine a lot darker because it has less water compared to the amount of solute or other waste that we're getting rid of. So to summarize one more time, if we're dehydrated and our brain is releasing a lot of ADH, that's going to cause the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to become permeable to water or leaky to water. Water is going to get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream at a greater amount so that we're not producing a lot of urine because we're trying to keep water in the body. However, if we've got plenty of water in the body, our brain won't be releasing ADH. And so if there's no ADH, then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct will not be permeable to water. That water is going to stay in the urine as it goes down the collecting duct and will produce a lot more urine. Now, filtration and reabsorption of the kidneys is a lot more complex than what I've presented in this diagram. There's lots of other ions involved. There's other hormones involved like angiotensin 1 and 2 and aldosterone and a bunch of other things. But this is a pretty good overview of how the system works. All right, that was a lot of information. Let's do a quick recap here. Blood is going to enter into the glomerulus from a renal artery. About 20% of that blood plasma is going to get filtered out into the Bowman's capsule. That filtrate will travel through the proximal convoluted tubule. About 2/3 of the water that got filtered out will get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream just here in the proximal convoluted tubule. Nutrients also get reabsorbed, so we make sure we keep all of those important nutrients in the bloodstream. The filtrate will travel down the descending nephron loop, where more water is going to diffuse out in the process of osmosis because this medulla is very salty. So water is going to diffuse out back into the bloodstream here. As the filtrate goes up the ascending nephron loop, sodium and chloride ions are going to get actively transported or pumped out of the nephron loop, which is what caused this medulla to be salty in the first place, which is driving the osmosis, which is happening in the descending loop. As that filtrate passes up into the distal convoluted tubule, more water can be reabsorbed into the bloodstream in the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting duct. But that's only going to happen in the presence of ADH. Our pituitary gland is going to release more or less ADH in order to regulate how much of this fluid gets reabsorbed. And that's how we'll regulate whether we produce a lot of urine or just a little bit of urine. Any fluid or waste that doesn't get reabsorbed will travel down the collecting duct to the ureter and then to the bladder, where we can expel it in the process of urination. Speaking of which, I need to go use the bathroom. But before I do that, take a moment, pause the video, and see if you can explain all of the stuff that I just explained. Talk about the process of filtration, what happens in the different tubules and loops, and then how this is regulated by ADH at the end.